year or two and let kind of what I do. So this first photo here, one of the interesting things about it is there's no real stars in the photo. And this is a technique you can try through an application called StarNet++, which is mainly available on the Windows computers. Anyway, the cool thing about that is you can really show the dust and the clouds of the nebula without all those bright distracting stars getting in the way. And this is something that's at least worth a try. If you look real closely, though, you see it's kind of splotchy and there are some problems with it, but still a unique type of photo you can do. Of course, we've got the more traditional North American nebula. This one's a lot of fun to photograph, especially if you have the right filters, because that's really what allows you to pull out all this amazing nebulosity. And we'll get into that more later on today. Of course, we have the Orion Nebula. This photo is actually just captured with a normal DSLR and a telephoto lens back in Ohio. And I wanted to include this one just to show you that you don't need to go out and buy all this fancy gear. Even with just a modest setup, you can still get some cool photos. And then we've got, of course,
that's incredible. That's absolutely incredible.
Yeah. And then we've got the Rosette Nebula right here. I'm sure you've all seen this one before. The Rho Ophiuchi. This is a really cool kind of dust lane that branches off from the core of the Milky Way. And whether you're shooting wide angle or with a more telephoto lens, you can get a pretty cool shot of it. Of course, we've got the Veil Nebula. This is probably one of everybody's favorite objects out there. It can be pretty tricky to photograph, though, because there's so many bright stars and the nebula itself is kind of dim. So unless you have the right filters, it can be very hard to pull off. There's the Heart Nebula. This is actually one I'm working on right now. It's one of the few objects I can see from the new place, at least where I'm set up for right now. So I'm looking forward to trying this one again. The Pleiades, and then finally the Andromeda Galaxy, the one that everybody really wants to get a cool photo of. This is my most recent attempt at Andromeda. I actually used the big Rasa telescope, and it might actually have been a little bit too much zoom because it's cutting off a little bit of it. So that's just kind of some of the photos that I've taken over the last year or two. I wanted to mention that, I mean, we're already recording this, so you can always go back and watch it. But if you want to take a quick screenshot at any time, you can hold down the Windows key plus the print screen button at the same time. If you want to try that right now, the screen should go black very quickly. And then that photo will be saved under your pictures screenshots folder. That's if you're on a Windows computer. So again, just hit Windows, print screen, and you'll be good there. For those of you on Mac, I don't have a Mac, but I found this online. I guess you hold down Shift, Command, and 3. That should also allow you to take some photos. So if you're on Mac, if you want to give that a try. And as always, you can take notes if you want to, or just rewatch the video, whatever's easier. So with all that out of the way, I thought we'd talk a little bit about how I even got into astrophotography, because that's one of the questions I get pretty often. If you've ever seen the movie Office Space, that was pretty much my life back in 2015 and 2016. At the time, I was working a really boring IT job, wasn't really going anywhere with it. I knew the company was going down the tubes, basically. It was a failing newspaper company. And I said, what am I doing here? I'm just wasting my life in this windowless gray room. So in 2016, I had had enough and I put in my 2 weeks and I decided to move on and drive out west. So I packed up my car, drove across the country, and in a day and a half, I ended up in the Rocky Mountains. And this is one of the first photos I took. Now, at the time, I wanted to become a professional landscape photographer. That was really my goal. And I thought I could make money selling prints or something along those lines. But it didn't quite work out that way. And as the summer progressed, I was capturing a lot of really cool photos and traveling to some of the most beautiful locations out west. And then one night when I was in the Great Sand Dunes, you can actually see my tent right here if you look closely. I went out and I got a permit to allow me to camp out here for the night. And after sunset, I took a nap. I woke up and I just saw the Milky Way really for the first time, just how big and mysterious it looked overhead. And at that point, I was kind of really hooked on astrophotography. And I spent the rest of the night just running around the sand dunes with my headlamp and trying all kinds of photos. And then for the rest of the trip, for the next 4 months, I would try and do astro every so often. And in fact, this photo was hanging up in the visitor center there at the Great Sand Dunes. So that was kind of cool how everything came full circle there. And there's a cool Star Trails photo from New Mexico. To make a long story short, I spent 4 months living out of my car. And then by the time October and November rolled around, it started to get kind of cold at night, as you would expect, especially up in the mountains. And plus, when you're sleeping in the front seat of your car and it's dark for 12 hours out of the day, there's really not much to do. And it got kind of boring. So I decided in November to drive back to Ohio, and I started working at a local camera shop. And I never wanted to do that because I'm not a salesman, but I learned a lot about the Canons and the Sonys and the Nikon cameras and all the different lenses. So it's a really good learning experience. And this is also when I first started teaching. And then when the solar eclipse was happening, I decided to drive back out west and do another road trip. This is the spot I saw the solar eclipse from. So it was pretty amazing. To be honest, though, the photos I got weren't that great. I've seen much better photos from people who didn't even know what they were doing. And then after the solar eclipse ended, I was on the road again, just kind of exploring. And to make another long story short, I was back on the road in 2018 for about 6, 7 months, and 2019 as well. And by 2017, jumping back a little bit, that's when I first started using a star tracker, which was a game changer for me. Sorry. The way I took this photo was with a Sky Tracker Pro and a 100 mm macro lens. And that really was a big experience for me because with a really simple setup, the 100 mm macro lens, it was never designed for this, but with the help of the star tracker, I could take some really cool shots. And then this was back in 2017. So as I got more into astrophotography with the help of that star tracker, I realized that there was no videos on YouTube that talked about how to use one. And I didn't know what I was doing at the time. So my goal became to create some videos to help other people out. Because if I was having a hard time with this, I imagine a lot of others were. And so in 2018, I created my Star Tracker courses. And at that point, I finally became the professional photographer I set out to be. And since then, I've just been working hard, trying to create new tutorials for all different types of trackers and mounts and things like that. And then in 2020, right before everything hit the fan, I moved out to Kanab, thankfully, and started living out in the desert, which has some of the darkest skies you could ever want. This photo taken here was about 20 minutes from my house. And even from my backyard, I could see the Milky Way. And just recently, like we said, I moved out to Washington. I left all these dark skies behind, but at the same time, I was ready for some change. So that's just a quick look at how I got where I am today. Basically, just lived out of my car for 4 years and then created those courses and some YouTube videos. And that's how I got to where I am today. So now that we got that out of the way, we're going to talk about gear. I know a lot of you guys probably have most of your gear already, but for those of you that are maybe looking to upgrade or invest in something else, let's talk about that. As you know, to take astrophotography photos, you're going to need a camera of some sort, whether that's just a simple DSLR or mirrorless camera, or better yet, one of the dedicated astro cameras. These will really make a big difference in what you can capture, and we'll look at that more later on. From there, you'll need a mount, which will move your camera with the speed of the stars. You can either go with one of the higher end go-to mounts or a smaller, easier to use star tracker, and then a controller of some sort. This is only really required if you're going to be using the go-to mount. And I normally recommend the ASI Air, which we'll see later on, but this is a really cool device that allows you to control everything from your smartphone. It really is a game changer. And then really one of the biggest investments that I made that turned out for the best were some narrowband filters. This might not sound like much, but if you're in a light polluted area, or if you're just not getting the photos you want, if you start taking narrowband images, it can really change everything. And then finally, you'll need a battery to power everything. I just use the brand called Jackery, but you can really use any type of battery. So that's the basics. And as you know, a DSLR is a great place to start because they're easy to use. They've got that nice live view display, so you can zoom in at any time and make sure your stars are focused and check your camera settings. And they can be used for other types of photography. But the problem with the DSLRs is that there's no way to cool down the camera's sensor. And when I was in the desert, this is a problem I ran into every night. because as that sensor gets hotter and hotter, there's going to be more grain in your photos, and that's really going to cause you problems. Another issue is that these sensors that are in these DSLRs, they were never designed for astrophotography. They're mainly designed for portraits and landscapes and weddings, things like that. And so we run into some problems when we're shooting in low light scenarios. And this brings us to the camera that I'm using, which is just the Nikon D780. I've had that for about a year and a half now. It works really well. Although, to be honest, I'm mainly using a dedicated astro camera at this point. And one thing I really wanted to focus on in this presentation is that you have to be careful if you're going to be using a DSLR, especially the Canon cameras, because I've seen this time and time again where you can have 5 of the exact same Canon cameras shooting, and each one will give you a completely different result. However, on Nikon and Sony, if you notice a problem in your images, chances are everybody else with that camera model will have the same problems, which is both a good thing and a bad thing, right? If you're buying a Nikon or a Sony and you know there's a problem, you're going to have that problem. If you buy a Canon that everybody says is great, your camera might be terrible. So let me show you what I'm talking about. This photo here was taken with a Canon 5D Mark IV during one of my workshops. And you could see that there's this really ugly purple line through the photo. And if you look throughout the image, you'll also see a bunch of other horizontal bands. And there are ways to reduce this in the final image, but this is just a nightmare to work with. And for that reason, I would normally recommend you actually upgrade the camera if you're seeing problems like this, because there's no sense in trying to deal with this for the rest of the year trying to shoot. And if we compare that to this image, this was also taken with a Canon 5D from the same location, and it looks great. We have a lot of fine detail here, nice natural colors, and most importantly, no horizontal banding. Even though they're the exact same camera model, they look completely differently. So that's what I was hinting at earlier, is that mainly on the Canon cameras, you really got to be careful that your sensor isn't performing like this. And for those of you on Nikon, maybe, in my case, my camera has a purple glow at the bottom of the photo, and everybody else with the Nikon D750 will also have this purple glow. You can kind of see it in this photo here. Now, I will show you some ways to reduce this later on in the presentation, but my whole point with this part of the presentation is just to talk about the fact that there's a lot of problems that are going to accompany your DSLR sensor. And that brings us to the dedicated astro cameras. This is what I'm currently using, because these are specifically designed for astrophotography. They've got a lot of really cool features where you can actually cool down the sensor to like minus 20 degrees Celsius, which is about 4 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit, and potentially even further than that. Plus, the dedicated astro cameras, when they're building them, they're actually picking out sensors from Sony mainly that have really good low light performance. And the filters over the sensor, if they even have one, are designed to not block the light coming from the nebula. So in every respect, these cameras are a great upgrade over just your standard DSLR. The only problem is there's no screens or buttons on here, and you're going to need some sort of external controller to actually use this camera, whether that's a laptop with some software or, again, the ASI Air. Now I want to show you some different images taken with a DSLR and a dedicated astro camera. That way you can see for yourself just how much of a difference there is if you're thinking about upgrading. This image here was taken with my Nikon D750, a telephoto lens, and the Skyguider Pro. So pretty modest setup. And it looks pretty cool, I think. If we compare that to this new photo that I took just a couple of weeks ago, now you're able to see all the H alpha data, all these nebula exploding in this galaxy. And I want to stress here that the main difference between these photos is the red H alpha data. And the only reason I'm seeing that is because I used a narrowband filter. If I didn't have that narrowband filter, then you wouldn't see any of the red. And for the most part, this would look almost identical to the photo with the DSLR. So there really wouldn't be that much of an upgrade. So keep that in mind. Here's another great example. This is the Rosette Nebula taken on a Nikon D750. If you look closely, you can probably notice a little bit of that purple glow again. And the image itself has a lot of problems with it. The nebula is kind of small in the frame. The colors are kind of weird. It's very grainy. Just doesn't look that great. But when we take a dedicated astro camera and put it on the same exact telescope that I used for this photo, we get this image here. Now the Rosette Nebula looks much more three-dimensional. It has that nice deep red color, and it looks great. So again, the big trick with this image is I use the H alpha filter to really pull out the details on the nebula. Another great example is the Horsehead Nebula. If you're trying to use a DSLR, there's a good chance you'll never get a good photo of the Horsehead. But when you use the dedicated astro camera with the narrowband filters, it's just a night and day difference. And this is one I always wanted to photograph. So when I first got my new camera and filters, that's what I did. And that's one of the best examples. Finally, we have the Veil Nebula taken on a Nikon D750. It looks okay, but I really had to work to even get this photo. And if we compare that to the dedicated astro camera, there's a pretty noticeable difference, mainly here in the center, where we have all this really cool nebulosity that wasn't really visible before on the DSLR. Again, because when they're building these cameras, they're not thinking about photographing little nebula and things. And so it just doesn't work that well. And then finally, Andromeda looks pretty cool with the DSLR, looks even cooler with the right filters and a dedicated astro camera. So I hope that gives you some idea of what the actual benefit would be. And at the end of the day, as long as your DSLR is working okay, that will be fine if that's what you want to use. But if you're ready to upgrade, I'd highly recommend looking into a dedicated astro camera. And in general, I think the Nikon and Sony cameras give more consistent results over Canon cameras, and you shouldn't have to worry about the banding problems that we saw earlier. For those who are interested, I'm currently using a ZWO ASI 1600 Pro. This is a monochrome sensor, which means all the photos I take are in black and white. But as I'll show you at the end of the presentation, it doesn't take much work to turn that into a color photo. We're going to keep moving on with the gear. And once we reach the end, we'll have time for questions. So you can always enter those in the chat and we can get to those later. But the ASIR Plus, I've got some YouTube videos on this already, but this is one of the best investments you can ever make. And the reason I'm so passionate about this little thing is because when I was first getting into astrophotography back in 2018, we were trying to learn to use the big go-to mounts. I was working with a guy in California. And when I was working with him, we would go out night after night and try and do the 3-star alignment and the polar alignment with their big go-to mounts. And we never even took a single photo because it was just so convoluted and nothing was working properly. But with the ASIR Plus, you can go out there and with a little bit of practice, like 1 or 2 nights, you can have everything connected and you can actually control everything from your phone while you're sitting on your couch. It's that amazing. So if it's freezing cold outside, you don't have to be out there freezing. You could be in the house warm and check everything over. And really the biggest reason to think about getting something like the ASIR is that it removes that technical barrier where if you're using a hand controller straight out of the 1990s, those things are so much of a pain to use that I just get so angry when I have to even deal with one. So you don't even have to worry about the hand controllers anymore with something like the ASIR Plus. And the great thing is because it generates its own Wi-Fi network, you can use it in your backyard or you could take it on a backcountry trip if you're out hiking or camping and it will still work because you just connect to its Wi-Fi network on your phone and you're all set. You don't need any sort of LTE connection or anything like that. Okay, next up we have mounts. And on the left, we have the Skywatcher go-to mount that I'm currently using. On the right, we have the little star tracker. This is the Skyguider Pro and the EQ6R Pro on the left. I used the Skyguider Pro from about 2017 until this year, actually. And it worked great for Milky Way and even deep space. But one of the problems is that if you want to use a larger telescope or have that go-to functionality, you need to get the bigger go-to mount. And for me, if I'm going hiking or camping, I'll take the little guy. But if I'm going to shoot from the backyard, then definitely I'll go with the go-to mount. So the great thing about the go-to mounts, as you probably know, is that you can automatically find the objects you want to photograph. If you have the ASIR, you can control every aspect of this from your smartphone or your tablet. They can handle the bigger telescopes. But as we talked about, they can introduce a lot of problems. And you could even spend a whole night trying to troubleshoot and never take a photo. which is incredibly frustrating if you only have a few clear nights per month. And if you're still new to astrophotography, I really want to stress right now that these mounts can be very heavy, anywhere from 30 to 50 pounds, and kind of a pain to carry around. So it would not be far-fetched to think that if you buy a mount and you're out there lugging it in the backyard in the middle of the night, you could very easily injure yourself, break a leg, break an arm, who knows what. And for that reason, if you're older or you're not in the best shape, whatever it is, if you don't have a go-to mount, that's something I would seriously consider, is the fact that these can be ridiculously heavy and very easy to injure yourself. And they're much more expensive than a star tracker usually. For those that are interested, I'm using the Skywatcher EQ6R Pro. I guess a lot of YouTubers are though, and these are back orders for months. So if you're trying to get one, good luck. And that brings us to the star trackers. These are great because they're lightweight and portable. They're cheap, usually $200, $300, $400. They're much easier to use. The way the star tracker works is you just do your polar alignment, which you can do in less than a minute. You turn it on and it's going to start moving your camera around. It's that easy. And if you compare that to a go-to mount where you have to do the alignments and the plate solving and all that other stuff, if you run into a problem with that, you could be stuck the whole night. Whereas with the star tracker, you turn it on, you do your alignment, and you're good to go. So for those of you that are looking to try Milky Way photography, a star tracker is one of the best investments you can make, because now you can shoot 4 or 5 minute long exposures and really get some clean images. The only issue I have with the star trackers is that you can only put about 7 or 8 pounds of camera gear on them before they just get overloaded. And the fact that you have to find all the objects manually, that means you move the camera and telescope up to where you think the Andromeda Galaxy is at, and you take a photo. If you don't see it in the frame, you manually move the camera around and take another photo. So it can take you anywhere from 5 minutes to an hour to find the object, which is a big hurdle for a lot of people, something you'll want to think about. For those that are interested, I use the Sky Guider Pro from Ioptron. I've been using the same mount for since 2017, and it still works really well. So I'd recommend it if you're looking to get a star tracker. And next up, we've got filters. This is really something I wanted to touch on today. In this photo here, we're looking at most of the filter options out there. We've got 1¼ inch, which is this threaded filter here. Then we've got what looks like the 36mm unmounted filters, as they're called. Now, there's different sizes, but the difference there is that these circular filters don't have any threads on them. And that means you have to install them very carefully into a filter holder. And as somebody who's terrible with little tools and screws, this was a nightmare to do. And for that reason, I generally recommend, if you're going to be buying a new set of filters, just go with the 2-inch threaded filter like you see here. That will make your life a lot easier and ultimately be the best investment. For those of you that are still shooting on a DSLR, they also make clip-in filters, which only work on some models of cameras. And they introduce a lot of problems like color casts and star distortion and things like that. So I don't really recommend the clip-in filters. You're better off just saving your money for when you're ready to use filters like this. So in terms of the filters, the big thing you want to consider is what type of camera you're using. Is it a DSLR or a dedicated astro camera? And then if you have a dedicated astro camera, are you using a monochrome or a color sensor? That's really the big thing. Because if I'm shooting in monochrome, I can only use one filter at a time. And therefore I had to buy 2 sets of filters, an L, R, G, and B set, and then a narrowband, which includes H alpha, oxygen, and sulfur. So that's 7 total filters I had to buy, and it cost me around $1,000 for everything. But the plus side is that I can get that really nice color balance and almost looks like it came from the Hubble with these filters. And I would say, honestly, that if you want to really take your photography to the next level and really make those nebulas stand out, you need to get a good set of narrowband filters. That's really going to make the difference in your astrophotography. And like I said, I recommend using the 2-inch filters because those are going to be the most compatible. If in the future you upgrade to a larger sensor or a bigger telescope, the 2-inch should still work fine. Whereas the 1¼ inch, they might be cheaper, but if you upgrade to a bigger, better camera or telescope, they may no longer work as intended. And if you're going to be buying all these filters, then I'd recommend a filter wheel as well. These are really nice because if you get the threaded filters, you can just quickly screw them all into these slots here. So I'd put L for luminance in slot 1, my red filter in slot 2, green, blue, H alpha, oxygen, and sulfur. Then in the ASIR software, I tell it which filters are in which position. And the great thing is now I can just go in my app and say, go to H alpha. It moves the filter in front of the camera and I can start shooting. That's way easier than having to go out there and physically unscrew the filter from your telescope every time you want to change. The only problem is these filter wheels are only compatible with some telescopes, like my Raza telescope. They're not compatible. It's just the way it's built, it won't work. But if you can use one, I'd highly recommend it. It's going to make things so much easier. And like we said, you can just use the software to do everything for you. I'm personally using a 7-position filter wheel from ZWO, and I'm using the 36 millimeter filters, which I don't recommend. Like I said, get the 2-inch filters. Those will work better for you. So that's what I'm using there. And now I'm just going to break down my current setup, and we should be ready to move on after that. I've got the ZWO ASI 1600 Pro, which is a monochrome camera, which costs you about $1,200. I'm using the William Optics Red Cat telescope, which has a focal length of 250 millimeters. And that might not sound like a lot, and it's definitely not a lot of zoom. But the great thing is when I pair this telescope with this particular camera, I get a crop factor of 2. Therefore, I'm basically shooting at 500 millimeters now just because I paired this camera with this telescope. And that's one of the reasons I love this setup, because I'm getting much more zoom than I probably should be, and I can get much better photos. For the mount, I'm either using my EQ6R Pro or the Skyguider Pro, depending on what I'm doing. I've got the LRGB and the narrowband filters. And then I've got the electronic filter wheel, auto guider and guide scope, and then the ASIR Plus. So that's what I'm using if you want to take a screenshot there, if you want to get into that. But here's just a quick photo of my setup. You can see it's very lightweight, portable, and surprisingly easy to use, which we'll look at later on. And it's all mounted on the Skyguider Pro. This was taken back in 2020 out there in the desert. And I just really love this thing. To be honest, this setup right here, I have no desire to upgrade from, so I'm probably going to use this for years to come. The camera works great. The filters work great. The telescope works great. There's no real reason for me to get a bigger, heavier telescope unless I just run out of objects to photograph and I want more zoom, but I'm really happy with it so far. And this is a photo I took with that particular setup. So it just shows you what's possible with some fairly modest gear. And at this point, if we have any questions, we can go over those now.
Right now, Peter, so you can carry on.
Okay, that works. Okay, now we're going to get into the fundamentals, because this is something I really want to make sure we're all on the same page on. I think we are, but there's always a little bit of confusion here. So the main reason that you're having grainy photos at night is for 2 reasons. First, you're not capturing enough light. This is true in both your individual exposures and your total amount of exposure time. In other words, maybe you're only taking 50, 30-second long photos and you're still not getting enough light. Or you're taking 10, 20-minute long photos and you're still not getting enough light. In addition, your sensor is probably generating a lot of heat. So to be clear, the 2 main reasons why your photos are grainy is because you haven't captured enough light yet, and the sensor was very hot and it was generating more noise. So in order to get better photos, you need to capture as much light as possible. Because let's think about this. The nebula and galaxies we're trying to photograph, they're pretty dim. If they were bright, we'd be able to see them with our naked eye. And even the Andromeda galaxy, you can barely make it out from the darkest locations. If you factor in too that your telescope, a lot of them out there, they're an aperture of f8 or f10 or 11, which is so little light coming from the front of the telescope to your camera. And so when you have this little tiny hole for light to come through, and there's barely any light coming in the first place, that means it could take you hours, if not multiple nights in a row, to get enough light to have a clean image. This is especially true if you're going to be shooting a narrowband. because when you have those narrowband filters, you're only letting a little tiny sliver of light in through that filter. So all these problems are compounding and just making your life more difficult. And that's why if you're just getting started, try to get at least 1 hour of data for any object you want to photograph. Although I would actually say, now that I'm doing narrowband a lot, I'm actually out there multiple nights taking photos, and I can add all that data together. It won't hurt anything if you're shooting on multiple nights. As long as you have a go-to mount and you're doing everything properly, the post-processing will never know the difference. And now I want to show you an example of how you can get better photos just by shooting longer exposures. This is mainly true for DSLR shooters. This image here was taken at 15 seconds, and I was just using my Nikon D750. If you look down here, you can see that there's a lot of purple glow, and overall the image just doesn't look very good. The simplest way to fix this is to just use a longer shutter speed. Rather than 15 seconds, I can shoot 4 minutes or longer. And this is a 4-minute long photo here. Look how much better that looks in every respect. First of all, the purple glow has disappeared. In addition, we have some color model like these ugly splotches. Those are all gone. The colors in the photo, like the green grass, looks much more natural and rich at 4 minutes. And the only issue here is that the stars have blurred out. But if you're doing Milky Way photography, this is why you buy a star tracker. So you take your 4-minute long photo for the foreground, you set up a star tracker, maybe right up here in the frame, aim up towards the sky, take a 4-minute long photo for the stars, and then in just a few seconds in Photoshop, you can blend them together and have a much better and cleaner looking photo. And the way I want you to understand this is that this is what's called a dark frame taken from my Nikon D750, which means no light reached the sensor. So all we're seeing right now is the noise generated by my camera, the static, if you want to think about it that way. The only way to remove that static or that white noise is to capture enough light or signal to overpower it. And that's really our goal with astrophotography, is to capture enough light to overpower the noise and make it disappear. So now if we zoom in, we can see that at 15 seconds, the blacks aren't even black. They're like purplish. We're actually losing some fine detail here on the hubcaps, but at 4 minutes, the colors are perfect. We can actually resolve more detail here, and it's just so much better. You couldn't even see this little red thing right here in 15 seconds, but at 4 minutes, it's clear as day. You can even notice the individual blades of grass at the front of the car once we shoot at 4 minutes. So this is mainly applicable to DSLR shooters trying to do Milky Way photography, but the same concept is going to apply regardless. And I just want to make sure we really made this obvious. So here's another example taken in Arches National Park. We have the iconic purple glow caused by my camera sensor, and it just doesn't look very good. But after 4 minutes, it looks amazing, right? Almost like I took the photo during the day. And that's the power of capturing more light. All right, so that's the first part of your problem. The second problem is the fact that our camera gets progressively hotter as the night goes on. And if you think about it, if I'm shooting multiple 4-minute exposures all night long, that sensor doesn't have a chance to cool down, especially in the desert. And the hotter it gets, the more noise it's going to generate, which is why those dedicated astro cameras work so well. Because if you apply power to it and it can cool down the sensor to minus 20 degrees Celsius, it has a big impact on the amount of grain in your photo. Whereas with the DSLR, it just gets hotter and hotter, and your images are going to look worse and worse. So this is a photo I took with my dedicated astro camera when the sensor was about 90 degrees Fahrenheit, and I forgot to turn on the cooling system. You might not realize it, but the Triangulum Galaxy is actually right here. You wouldn't know though, because it's so obscured by all the grain, like we saw earlier. But when I turn on the camera's cooling system and I go down to about 0 degrees Fahrenheit, it's still kind of hard to see, but that's a much cleaner image than it was before. And this difference is caused by turning on the camera's cooling system. So think about it. If we have this much grain from a hot sensor and we had all those other problems by shooting 15 seconds, you can see why so many people have trouble with astrophotography. And now that you've seen how to fix those problems, hopefully that will work its way into your workflow and allow you to get better photos. Therefore, what I recommend is whenever possible, capture as much light in each photo. So rather than shooting 20-second long exposures, try for 3 or 4 or 5 minutes if you can. That way, each individual photo has a lot more light in it. Then, as you know, for deep space work, the more photos you have to stack together, the better. And if I can stack together 50 photos, the algorithms will work a lot better than they would if I only had 10 photos. Plus, if you can cool down that sensor, that's really going to help. And that's how you're going to get better photos is, again, a cooler sensor and capturing more light, both in terms of longer exposures and taking more photos. Next, we have our camera settings, which is something that I'm sure you all want to hear because people are always a little bit confused with the camera settings. First up, we have ISO, also known as gain, on the dedicated Astro cameras. They're basically the same thing. And the problem is they're the most misunderstood setting out there because if you Google ISO, you're probably going to get the wrong info. I want to be very clear. As you increase the ISO or the gain, you're not changing the camera's sensitivity to light, which is the common misconception. All you're doing is amplifying whatever light was captured. The way I like to think about this is that when you take your photo, let's say it's a 60-second long exposure. So you're capturing light is hitting the sensor over the course of 60 seconds. Once the exposure ends, the sensor stops collecting light. It takes all that signal it captured and it turns it into an electronic signal. At that point, that's usually where the ISO or the gain comes in. So now that you have this electronic signal that's been captured over the course of those 60 seconds, the ISO or the gain will amplify that signal, and the end result is that the image will look brighter, although it's still the same amount of light. So to be clear, it doesn't matter if you're shooting at ISO 100 or 6400, all of those photos will have the exact same amount of light in them. The only difference is that in the camera, the higher ISO has amplified the signal and made it brighter. And you can actually do the same exact thing in post-processing for the most part, where you just move a slider and it's like you're increasing the ISO in your camera, which actually can give you better results in some scenarios. So this is something I cover on YouTube and on my website, which you can look at if you want to learn more. But I'll just show you 2 examples. We'll call this photo A, and here's photo B. They were taken with completely different ISOs, and then in post-processing, I made them the same brightness, but you'd probably never be able to tell which one was which. In reality, this is what photo A looked like before I did the post-processing to it. It was very dark compared to the other image. But when I increased the exposure slider in post-processing, now ISO 400 looks identical to ISO 3200. There's the same amount of light coming into the sensor. And now that we've equalized the brightness, it's the same thing. I'm sure you're probably a little bit confused right now. That's okay. I just wanted to introduce this concept to you. And if you want to learn more, like I said, I have more information on my website about this. The main thing to understand is that the ISO or the gain does not do anything until after the exposure is ended. And then it amplifies the data you captured and makes it brighter. But you can always do the same thing in post. So for that reason, in order to choose the best ISO or gain for your camera, there's no real easy answer because we're all shooting under different scenarios, depending on the amount of light pollution, the aperture of your telescope, the shutter speed you're going to be using that night, the object you're photographing. You get the idea. And that means it's up to you to figure out what's going to work best. I'm usually between ISO 800 and 6400 when I'm out shooting in the desert. That works well. But now that I'm up here in Washington, I might be at ISO 200 or 400 because there's a lot of extra light in the atmosphere from the city lights. Again, I always have to just kind of figure it out when I start shooting. If I'm using my dedicated Astro camera, my gain is usually between 0 and 150. And this is kind of where there's a weird discrepancy because ISO makes more sense to me. You go 100, 200, 400, 800, 1600, etc. Those are full stops. But with gain, it's just kind of this arbitrary slider from 0 to like 300 on my camera, which to me doesn't make any sense. But the only reason I would use a gain of 0 is if I'm photographing something really bright like the full moon or the Orion Nebula. Because if I use a gain of 150, it's going to amplify that signal and it's actually going to blow out the highlights. When it blows out those highlights, it clips the data and I can never bring that back in post-processing. It's gone forever. So as I mentioned before, you generally want to underexpose the photo to preserve the highlight detail, because in post-processing, you can brighten it up as much as you need to, but you can never darken the image and retain the highlights that have been lost. So keep that in mind. If in doubt, use a lower ISO or a lower gain. Okay, for your shutter speed, kind of the same thing. I can't tell you what to use because depending on your tracking accuracy and your focal length mainly, that's going to determine how long you can shoot. I'm normally shooting 2 to 5 minutes long because my thought process is I want to get more light in each photo to have a cleaner final image. But I don't want to necessarily shoot 20-minute long photos because if you think about it, if I'm out there shooting 20-minute long exposures, maybe the neighbor's light turns on, or I go out and accidentally kick the tripod leg, or anything can happen over the span of 10 to 20 minutes. And if it does, you've just wasted a huge amount of time you're never going to get back. Whereas if I'm shooting 1 minute long photos or 5 minute long photos, if something happens during that time span, it's not as big of a deal. So for that reason, I'm normally shooting 5 minutes long. So you can kind of factor that into your equations. If you're in a light polluted area, you might want to use a faster shutter speed. So only 1 or 2 minutes long. That way the image doesn't get too bright. And if you guys have any questions, we can go over those now.
Again, no questions, Peter.
All right, we'll keep chugging along.
You're doing very clear. That's very clear. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, now's the fun part. We're going to talk about my workflow. And I think you guys will see that it's super easy to do. And you might want to try it yourself if you can get all the similar gear. So the first thing we always want to do, as you know, is find the North Star. And for me, there's a very easy way to do this, whether I'm out in the backcountry or I'm here in the city. I want to look for the Big Dipper because this will always be visible when you're shooting at night, whether you're in the brightest or the darkest sky. Once you've found the Big Dipper, then we're going to take this particular corner star and draw a line out. This will always take us to Polaris. It's that easy. And Polaris is not the biggest or brightest star. It's a common misconception, but it is fairly bright. And again, even if you're in a light polluted area, you should still be able to see it. Another thing I wanted to draw your attention to is the fact that the Big Dipper rotates counterclockwise throughout the night and throughout the year. So don't always expect to see the Big Dipper in this position. Maybe tonight it'll be up here like this. The same principle applies though. Take that same corner star, draw a line out, and that'll take you to Polaris. Now that you can see Polaris overhead, let's talk about what we're actually doing for our polar alignment, because this is also a source of confusion. We're not actually trying to center up Polaris in our polar scope because, as you see here, Polaris is not the center of rotation. This particular spot is what we call the North Celestial Pole. This is the spot where all the stars rotate around. If you're in the southern hemisphere, then you'd be looking south, and this would be the South Celestial Pole. So when we do our polar alignment, really what we're trying to do is aim the mount up exactly to this spot. And if we do that, then we've done a perfect polar alignment. If our mount is aimed over here though, or down here, then we start to run into star trails and other issues. And the great thing is the polar scopes are designed that way. When we position Polaris on our little reticle, we know that our mount has actually been properly aligned to this spot. So just want to make sure we covered that. And for my workflow, once I found Polaris, I'm going to set up my mount and aim it up towards Polaris. The way I do this is I just kind of look over the back of the telescope and everything. Once my mount is roughly aiming up towards Polaris, I attach my counterweight first. If you have a big telescope and you put that on your mount before the counterweights, it's possible the whole thing could swing around and crash. So you always want to put on your counterweights before you attach any camera gear. Then after the counterweight is securely installed, you can put on your telescope and your camera and your cables and all that. After you've got everything looking good, then I normally crouch back down behind the telescope and I make sure that Polaris is visible right over the center. If my telescope's pointing off to the right or the left, I adjust it so it's aimed right up towards Polaris. And honestly, with my big heavy go-to mount, I could even do the polar alignment during the day because I know where to aim up to roughly. I'm usually within 2 degrees of a perfect alignment. So the reason I'm saying that is with a little bit of awareness of your location and some practice, you can totally do your polar alignment roughly, even during the day. So after you've got everything aimed up towards Polaris, now would be a good time to balance your right ascension and declination. And for this, the way you do it normally is you loosen the right ascension, turn everything horizontally. So your camera and telescope are on one end and your counterweight's on the other, and just move the counterweight left and right until neither side pulls down. If that looks good, you can rotate everything back up to start. And now we're going to balance the declination axis. This is much easier to do on a go-to mount than it is on a star tracker, but the same principle applies. What you're going to do is either slide the entire camera and telescopes forward or backwards. If you have a big heavy lens like this, chances are this is going to be heavier than the camera. So it's going to want to pull down. And if that's the case, we can slide everything backwards or forwards to balance it out. Or if you've got a really big heavy camera, it might be back heavy. So you can slide it around. And the end result is that it's neither front or back heavy. This makes more sense in a video. So for that, I do have a YouTube video if you want to learn more. But it's a pretty simple process with a little bit of practice. Now that we're properly balanced, we're going to put less stress on the mount, and it should actually work quite a bit better. Now would be a good time to turn on the power of our battery, the mount, the controller you're using. And I always like to make sure that my cables aren't going to get snagged, because sometimes I'll have a really short cable. And if my telescope goes to an unexpected location, there could be some serious problems. Then, with everything ready to go, we can put on our Batnov mask. This is a really good invention from a Russian astrophotographer named Batnov. And he figured out that if you just cut some slits in a little piece of plastic and put that over the front of your telescope, you get this diffraction spike, which we see right here. Notice how there's 3 lines, a top line, a middle line, and a bottom line. This is going to allow us to get perfect focus every time. So what you want to do is take a photo with the Batnov mask on, and you should see something like this. However, if that center line is up or down, it's not perfectly centered up, that means you need to refocus the telescope. So we can go to our focus ring, make a slight adjustment, and take another photo. Maybe now this line moved too far the other way. You get the idea. Eventually, once it's perfectly focused, your middle line will be directly in the middle. And now you know for sure that your stars are sharp. For those of you with really good eyes, you might see up here in the upper right that, in fact, this star is focused, but this one isn't. And that brings up some problems. Basically, a lot of our lenses and telescopes aren't perfectly built. And for that reason, the stars in the center of the frame might be sharp, but the stars in the corner might not be. And that's just something we have to deal with. So generally, if we're photographing something, we're going to put in the center of the frame. So as long as the stars in the center look sharp, it's good enough for me. All right, so we focused our telescope. Now we can take off the Batnov mask. We don't need it anymore. And we can do our polar alignment next using the ASI Air software that I mentioned earlier. And this is one reason I love using the ASI Air Pro or Plus, because in just a few seconds, it's going to do almost everything I need it to, and it'll leave me at this window here. This is where it tells me I need to move my mount upwards 1 degree, 45 minutes, 26 seconds, and to the right, 26 minutes, 43 seconds. I never even have to look through the polar scope anymore. I just roughly set up my mounts aimed up towards Polaris. I start the software and it tells me what to do. So now that I know I need to move the mount upwards, I go to my altitude and azimuth screws here on the base, and I make an adjustment. If I think I've gone up about a degree, I hit the refresh button, it takes a new photo, and it updates the values. And so I can normally have a really good polar alignment in less than 2 or 3 minutes using this workflow right here. And for your total error, I normally like to have it 5 minutes or less. That works really well for me, but the more zoom you have, the more precise your alignment has to be, which can be very tricky to do because it's almost like you're just chasing your tail eventually, and it just gets harder and harder. So that's how we do the polar alignment with the ASI Air software. And then if we're happy with our total error, we can hit the stop button and we're done. I never even had to crouch down and look through the polar scope. From there, our next goal is to choose an object we want to photograph, whether that's the Triangulum Galaxy or the Heart Nebula, whatever it is. Once we've decided what we want to photograph, we're going to plate solve, and then we're going to use the go-to to move right to the object. So here in the application for the ASI Air, I can take a photo, and then what's going to happen is that the ASI Air will actually see all of these stars. It will use its internal database, and it will learn the exact coordinates that we're aimed up to. So all I have to do is take a photo, click the plate solve button here on the left, which is currently grayed out. And then when I click plate solve, it analyzes all those stars. And in less than 1 second, it now has my precise right ascension and declination coordinates. And it knows the focal length I'm using and my camera's sensor size and everything. It's just so smart. And the best part is now I can hit the sync mount button, and it's going to transmit all this information to my go-to mount. Now my mount knows exactly where it's aimed up to. I never had to do a 2 or 3 star alignment or any of that crap. I did it in less than 1 second, and I'm ready to go. I can go to any object I want. It's that easy. So I'll go to the favorites objects next, or whatever you want to do. And this is where you just scroll down, you find whatever object you want to photograph for the night. In this case, the Triangulum Galaxy. I'll click on it, and then I'll hit this circular button here, which stands for go to. Now it's going to slew the mount around to the correct coordinates. Once it gets the object centered up, it will take another photo. And it's kind of hard to see, but there's the Triangulum Galaxy. And that only took us less than 2 minutes usually to do. It's so easy to do, and I just really love this. So at this point, with our object centered up, the only thing left really is to begin our guiding and then figure out what camera settings we're going to use. In the ASI Air software, this is really easy to do as well. If you have an auto guider, you just come in here, we'll click the looping arrows, and this will trigger our auto guider to start taking photos. And you would see a bunch of stars on the screen. Then we click this little crosshair button to begin guiding. It will automatically pick the best star. It will do a calibration. Once the calibration completes, we're going to see the blue and red lines on our graph, which indicates that we're guiding. The reason we want to do guiding is because it really makes the mount so much more accurate. In fact, when I first started using a go-to mount, I could only shoot 60-second long exposures before I got star trails when I was not guiding. When I attached the auto guider, I could easily shoot 5-minute long exposures and the stars were sharp. So I increased my total exposure time by 5 times with the help of the auto guider. The way I like to think about it is, without the auto guider, your mount's just kind of slacking off at work. It's sitting on its phone. It's just not doing its job. When you have the auto guider running though, now it's like the boss is sitting right behind you and it's telling you, come on, we got to work, let's go. And it just works so much better. And for that reason, if you don't have an auto guider yet, I'd highly recommend getting one. You can get them as cheap as $250 for everything. And it really is amazing just how much better they'll make your tracking accuracy, really. And with the ASI Air software, it's super easy to do all of it too. But while that's running, I'll go to my shooting schedule. And this is how I actually control that dedicated Astro camera. I can tell it to take 15 5-minute long photos with my H alpha photo first. After those complete, it will take 15 photos with the oxygen filter, each 5 minutes long. And I can configure this however I want to. Maybe rather than oxygen, I want to choose a green or a blue filter. And because I'm using that filter wheel, I can control everything here through the app. It's really nice. And oh, let's go back here. You can also choose if you want to shoot light, bias, flat, or dark frames, which is something that a lot of people have questions on is how do I shoot flats or darks or bias, whatever it is. One thing I would recommend is if you have a clear night, just focus on taking light frames because our number one goal is to capture light. So why would we waste our time at night trying to take flat frames and dark frames? Don't worry about it. The following night, when it's probably going to be cloudy, then's the time to take your dark frames, your flats, your bias, whatever you want to do. And another nice feature of having a dedicated astro camera is that because you can cool down the sensor to any value you want, then that means you can take your darks really whenever you want. Because the big thing with dark frames is that the sensor temperature is the same between your lights and your darks. So we can do all this on the following night without any issue. If you have a DSLR, that really complicates things. And we're not really getting into that tonight. I just wanted to show you that really with the ASAR software is really easy to do. And again, the whole reason I'm bringing this up is just because, you know, when I was first getting started, oh, we're almost done here. This is the final window here. I'm taking my photos now, all 44. In this case, I was photographing the Heart Nebula, and I've got the guiding running. So now I could sit on my couch and watch a movie or play video games while my mount is running. And at any time, I can zoom into the preview here and make sure my stars are sharp. Maybe the focus has shifted a little bit because the temperature cooled down outside. I can instantly see that, and I can go out and fix it immediately. Or if I notice a big jump in the guiding graph, that tells me maybe something fell down or there was a gust of wind, who knows what. But the fact that I can immediately see any problems and fix them is huge, because in the past, I would go in the house, I might start playing a video game or watch a movie, and I would forget about the mount, or it'd take me 30 minutes to get back out there, and I have no idea what's going on. So this is really a game changer. And again, what I was saying earlier is that the reason I love this whole workflow is because with just a little bit of practice, it really opens up a whole new world of possibilities. Because think about it, if you could give this to your kid or your grandkid and have them do everything through their smartphone and you help them out with the setup process, I mean, they can start getting photos like they see in the Hubble within a few nights. That's the power of this workflow. Whereas in the past, even myself and some other people, we couldn't even get the hand controller to work and the mount would just get stuck. And you go 3 or 4 nights in a row without taking a single photo. So this is really a game changer. And I just wanted to show you how my workflow goes. And hopefully, if you're having some trouble, you can give this workflow a try, and that will really simplify your night and make your life a lot easier moving forward. So now we're going to get into the post-processing.
Can I
And
ask a couple of questions, Peter? Is this a good time or?
yeah, no, it's perfect time. Yeah.
I missed a question on cameras. What
Okay.
about offset with an astro camera? I think this probably was related to gain and ISO. Correct, Bruce?
Yeah, on mine, it asked me to put in a gain and an offset. It was kind of unclear what the offset was, how to set the offset.
Yeah. To be honest, I think I've only ever seen the offset in some of the laptop applications. So I'm not actually too familiar with that, to be honest. Normally
This came from the ASCOM driver itself.
yeah. I couldn't really tell you, unfortunately. I normally am just dealing with gain on my camera. So I would think it's similar though. Yeah.
It was a gain also. It asked for both.
Yeah. Yeah, I've never used offset. There's no option to even mess with that in the ASIR software. So I couldn't tell you.
That's true.
Okay.
Another question, Peter. Can you use ASIR pole alignment and other features with the Sky Guider Pro, even though that's not a go-to mount? Can you drive it, do the plate sort by hand and do the adjustments by hand?
That's a great question. So there's quite a bit you can actually do with the ASIR and the Sky Guider, because that's what I was doing. You can do guiding, of course. You can do the polar alignment. You can plate solve, but the only feature you're really missing out on is the fact that there's no go-to. So what you would do is you take the photo, you'd plate solve it, and you get the right ascension and declination coordinates you're aimed up to. And if you're really good with that kind of stuff, then you could theoretically know how to move the mount. And For me though, I'm more of a visual guy. So I just take a photo and I can kind of tell what stars I'm looking at, and then I make an adjustment. So yeah, you can do 90% of the stuff you need to with a sky guider. You just can't do the go-to.
Okay. Last question here, Peter. What is the name of the software for Windows you mentioned in the beginning?
Yeah, that's StarNet++.
StarNet++. And that basically takes the stars out of a picture that you take, and you get a starless picture, basically.
Yeah, it's kind of hit or miss, and it's only available on Windows computers, and it's kind of weird to use it because it's not very intuitive. You have to run like bat files and rename specific photos to fit into the program. It's kind of weird. So I'd recommend watching some YouTube videos first to get the hang of it. But the end result, yeah, is that you run the StarNet++. It could take upwards of an hour to complete. And when it does, you'll have a completely starless photo, which probably won't look that great. So you'll have to spend another 20 or 30 minutes fixing all the splotches it left behind. So it's definitely not a streamlined thing at all, but it's kind of fun to mess around with if you have a free night.
Good. Sorry to interrupt you.
Oh, no, you're good. Yeah, we're almost done. So what we're going to do now is a quick post-processing lesson. And I just want to really stress here that you can go out and get the best data in the world, but if you don't know how to process it, you're never going to get the photos that you want. This is an older image I did with just a DSLR. I just want to show you here that the raw photos, you wouldn't even know what you're looking at. But with the right processing, now we have a full galaxy visible. Same thing with this one here. I doubt you can even see what we're looking at, but with a little bit of Photoshop work, now we know we're actually photographing the Veil Nebula. And this was the finished stacked image of the Veil Nebula. But when I ran it through some Photoshop effects, it's just night and day difference. So with that said, let's get out of here. And all right, I'm going to start up Photoshop. We'll go through this together.
While you're doing that, can I ask another question?
Yeah.
We were having a discussion around filters. For filters for galaxies versus nebulas, big difference in using narrowband with galaxies?
In my experience, not really. I mean, we did see that if we scroll back up here, I'll just pull this one up. You know, this is just a standard RGB photo, and you really can't see any of the nebula and Andromeda, right? But when I use the H alpha filter, then we're able to see a lot more. So I would say with galaxies, you really don't need the narrowband necessarily. You won't notice that much of a change. But at the same time, you're going to be shooting nebula, I'm assuming, too. So you might as well get a good set of narrowband like the H alpha and oxygen at least. Okay. And yeah, I think they're a lot of fun to work with.
All right, thanks.
Yeah. Okay. I don't know how familiar you guys are with Photoshop and this type of processing, but I'm going to go through it. I guess we're actually doing pretty good on time, so I'll slow down a little bit today. The way this works is we've got my 4 images here. So I've already gone through and stacked them, but these were taken with my monochrome camera. We've got my blue data here, my red data here, and my green data here. And then we also have an H alpha layer right here. They don't look very good at all though, right? And that's normal because like I said throughout the presentation, I'd rather underexpose the photo to preserve the highlights, and then I can bring up the brightness as much as I need to here in post-processing. And what I want to show you is how to create a beautiful color photo from these black and white dark monochrome images. And it's going to be the same process no matter what you're doing. So the way this works is we have an adjustments window right here. And I've got a lot of YouTube videos that cover the same exact process. So I don't expect you to memorize this all tonight. It's just good to just see what I'm doing. And the way this works is we're going to add a levels adjustment layer just by clicking this button. Now we have this window here. And if you were to look very closely, you notice a little tiny narrow spike here towards the black area of my histogram, which means all of the data in this photo is crumped up in the black area and we can't see it. So what we want to do is stretch the histogram. And very simply, we're just going to move the gray point to the left. And now we can start to see something. But it looks very pixelated and it doesn't look quite right. Because of that, I'm going to hit Control, Shift, Alt, E all at the same time. And that creates a new layer if you did that correctly. Again, that's Control, Shift, Alt, E. I'd write that down, or again, I cover this a lot on YouTube. If you're on a Mac, then your keys are Command, Shift, Option, E. Again, that's Command, Shift, Option, E if you're on a Mac. And the end result here is that you're just creating a new layer, in this case called layer 1. That's all it's doing. And then we're going to repeat this process as many times as we need to. For that, we'll go back up to our levels adjustment. We can see the spike a lot better now, right? It's moved out from the blacks and it's kind of out here in the between the blacks and the midtones. So what I'll do is the same exact thing. Move my midpoint towards the spike, and then I'll grab my black point and move it towards the back of the spike. This will add contrast, like so. If I think it looks good, I'll hit Control, Shift, Alt, E again. And look at that. There's our blue data of the Horsehead Nebula. It's pretty grainy. There's not a lot of blue, as you would expect, but still looks kind of cool. And with just 2 levels, we went from you couldn't even see what we were photographing to a nice look at the Horsehead Nebula. Let's repeat that same exact process for our red, green, and H alpha. Let's go with green next. And this will bring us to an important point. One of the problems we have with astrophotography, especially if you have a DSLR or even just a color dedicated astro camera, is what's called the Bayer array. And if you've heard of that, hopefully you have. The way the Bayer array works on a color camera is that it essentially designates 50% of the pixels towards the color green. That leaves 25% of the pixels for red and 25% of the pixels for blue light. And that's not really good for astrophotography, as you're going to see here. Imagine reserving 50% of our sensor for this data, green, on the Horsehead Nebula. You can't even hardly see anything here because there's not really any green in the photo compared to even blue. The Horsehead Nebula stands out a lot better. Yet on a color camera, you're dedicating 50% of the pixels to this data, which is almost useless. Really, the reason I bought a monochrome camera is because if I'm doing astrophotography, I want to get 100% red and 100% blue, and if we need to, 100% green. And that's the way it works if you get the L, R, G, and B filters, as well as the narrowband filters as well. Because now, when I put those filters in front of my monochrome camera, there's no Bayer array on there. It's just the pixels. They can get all the light they want to. And I'm getting 100% of the red light now when I put on the red filter. I hope that makes sense. And you can see that the red image probably has the most interesting data so far. If we compare that to green, I mean, it's a night and day difference. And this is why I love having the monochrome camera. Even compared to blue, it's quite a bit different as well. Now, one thing I should mention is that as we're going through our red, green, and blue, if the green image is a lot darker, that's going to cause a color cast when we turn this into a color photo. So what you should ideally do is make sure that all 3 of your color channels are the same brightness, and that will reduce any chance of a color cast. So I think right about here, see how red and green now are roughly the same overall image brightness? That should give us some much better image down the road. All right, so we've got our blue, green, and red images ready to go. And for this, I can choose any one of them, either red, green, or blue. I'll just go with blue today. Then I'll go up to image, mode. And if we look in here, it's currently on grayscale because I was shooting with a monochrome sensor. I need to change it from grayscale to RGB color to create my color photo. Once I click RGB color, I'm just going to hit don't flatten. And now over here on the right, we have the channels tab, red, green, and blue. But each color channel has the exact same blue data. So very simply, all you have to do is grab the green data right here, copy it, and paste it in on the green color channel. Then we'll grab the red data, copy it, and paste it in on the red color channel. And since this is blue.tiff, we already have the blue data on the blue color channel. It was there by default. Now, when I turn on all my eyeballs, we have a color image. It was that easy. All I did was copy the data to the color channels and I'm done. You know, it really doesn't take much time at all. And there's a bit of a color cast, but overall, I think that looks pretty good as a starting point anyway. Now, let me show you how to add in that H alpha data, because this is really what's going to take your images to the next level. We're going to repeat the process with the levels. We'll move our midpoint over. It looks terrible. So we hit Control Shift Alt E. That fixes the problem. We'll go back, we'll add another levels, move the midpoint over, Control Shift Alt E. And then we'll do this one more time. Maybe something like that. And I want to compare this to green, for example. So think about it. If I'm shooting with a monochrome camera, I'm getting 100% now H alpha, and I can really target the wavelengths that I want with my camera. Compared to the color DSLRs, you're getting all this kind of data that you don't even really want in your photo, which is why we have so many issues photographing the nebula on a normal camera. But the H alpha data is just so much fun to work with. And this next part is going to be a little bit confusing. So it's really hard to explain because it's very abstract. Everything's black and white. I'll do the best I can. Right now, I'm renaming this layer to H alpha. Okay, we have H alpha right here. This is our H alpha data. What I want to do is incorporate this into our color photo. And the way you normally do this is we grab our red data, we'll copy the red data, and we're going to paste it as a new layer here on top of the H alpha data. And I'll even call this red. So right now we're actually looking at the red data. It's been pasted on top of the H alpha data. So what I want to do is lower the opacity of this red layer from 100% to just about 20 or so. And again, this is very abstract, but basically all I've done is I've taken just a little bit of the red data and overlaid it with the H alpha. So we're getting more of the red color. Then I'll hit Control Shift Alt E, and I'm going to create a composite image of the red plus the H alpha. And I'll call this H alpha plus red. Finally, I'll select this. And rather than just using the boring old red data, I'm going to incorporate the H alpha plus red data that we created a second ago. And now look how much better that looks. It still needs some work, but here's our before. The red channel really didn't have much going for it. Now that we have the H alpha data though, it looks much more authentic. There's more of the finer details and dust visible. And I think it just looks 10 times better. And that's what we call H alpha plus red technique. Now that we've at least got our color photo completed, we can start with some contrasts and curves and things like that. So what I normally like to do now is add a curves layer. With the curves layer, I can click on this little hand tool right here. And the way the hand tool works is if I move over the screen, I have a little eyedropper. So if I want to make an area brighter or darker, all I have to do is click and drag down to make it darker, not that dark. And then I can click and drag up to make an area brighter. This is using the hand tool. And with that one curve layer, we added a lot of nice contrast. Next, I can go back to my adjustments. I'm also going to crop the image in a little bit, get rid of those annoying corners. But with the new curves layer, if you have a weird color cast, now would be the time to fix it. And there's a very easy way to do this. We have 3 droppers here, a black point, a gray point, and a white point. And the way you want to think about this is if I click on the black point dropper and hover over the image, wherever I click in the photo, it's going to try to make that pitch black. So the horse head should probably be pretty much black, right? If I click on that, then it should fix the contrast and the colors at the same time. You might not really like that though. So one thing I like to do is change the blending mode here from normal on this drop-down window to color. Now, this curve that we're doing is only affecting the colors in the photo. It's not affecting the contrast. So what I can do at this point is continue to adjust the colors until they look natural. Maybe I'll click over here with the black point dropper, and now the colors are more blue than they were before. I don't really like that, but you get the idea. I'm using the black point dropper, and I'm just clicking around the photo until I get a color balance that I like. It's that easy. Then I can use the midpoint dropper as well and find somewhere that should be kind of grayish. Maybe over here, I don't know, we'll click there. Wow, look at that. There's our before and after. We kind of got rid of that overly purple color cast. However, I think it's a little bit too green now. It's kind of greenish here. So I could just lower the opacity of this layer, and that would kind of balance it out. So here's our final before and after. Now we have a much more natural color balance to the photo. Another really good trick to know is what's called selective color. This is a tool that I use every single image. And the way selective color works is you can choose all of your primary colors here. In this case, we'll choose red. With the red selected, I can either subtract cyan or add cyan to the red color channel. And as you can see, this will have a big impact on the colors in my photo. Or if I want to add magenta or reduce magenta, I can do that. I can add yellow to get those real nice, vivid reds, or remove it. You get the idea. And then I can do yellows next if I want to, which will target the flame nebula. I can make the flame a little bit more red or yellow, whatever I want to do. And the best part about selective color is that I can stack these on top of one another. So I can always just go back, add a new selective color, and continue to edit those reds. So I can really make them look exactly the way I want to. So yeah, that's how I use my selective color tool. And then finally, before we end this quick little tutorial, I want to show you the camera raw filter. For this, we'll go to filter, camera raw filter. And this is one of the easiest ways to edit your photos if you're still new to Photoshop. The way it works is you're going to have a bunch of sliders and you just move them around until your photo looks better. Right here, we can adjust the temperature and the tint very easily. You don't have to mess around with the curves anymore if you don't like that. Then we can make the image brighter or darker. We can also adjust the contrast. I can bring down the highlights. That way the stars aren't as bright. I can bring up the shadows to reveal some more of the detail there. You get the idea. Just move some sliders around until it looks good to you. I could even add a little bit of texture to the photo. But most importantly, and really the main reason I came in here, is that I noticed I had a lot of color noise in the photo. If you think back to earlier in today's presentation, the reason I have a grainy photo is mainly because I didn't capture enough light. I only have about an hour total of data here. And if I would have captured a couple hours of data, the image would be vastly cleaner. Therefore, because I didn't capture enough light, I have to come in here in post-processing and clean it up. And I can do that under the Detail tab on the right. Under the Detail tab, we have sharpening, noise reduction, and color noise reduction. Right now, we have a lot of color noise. And I see this in so many astrophotos, so I want to show you how to reduce it in yours. Under the color noise reduction slider, I'll just move it up to maybe 25. And look at the difference. Here's before, just really gnarly looking everywhere. And then after, it's much cleaner and less noticeable. I could even increase the color noise a bit further to reduce some problems, but I think that looks great. And then from here, I can also adjust the noise reduction slider to smooth out some of that grain. I don't want to go too far here though and lose the finer detail. So there's always a sweet spot. Yeah, so that's a very quick, easy way to remove grain from your photos as needed. And then you can always do some other interesting techniques in here, but I'm not really going to get into those today. So we'll just hit OK, and it's going to apply that to the image. I think it looks pretty good there. And think about it. We went from something like this, right? Just grainy, ugly, black and white, couldn't see anything, to this. Oops, sorry, to this one here in just a few minutes. And I hope that shows you that with just a little bit of practice in Photoshop, once you get the hang of the interface and you know how to use your levels and curves, you can really get some really good results. And if you want to learn more about that, I've got a lot of YouTube videos that will go into this more. I've also got some courses on my website, which have dozens of hours of content in there. And if you want to see even more tutorials, I've got a Patreon as well. That's kind of an offshoot where users submit requests on things they want to see, and we'll go through it together. And I mainly post my images on Instagram. So if you're on there, you can check me out. But that's about all I've got for you today. So if you guys have any questions, we can go over those now.
There weren't any other questions except thank you for sharing your tips. I have one question, which was when you combine the red, blue, and green, you did a kind of a visual adjustment of the brightness of those different layers.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any way to see what that brightness level is so that you can be a little more accurate about this?
Yeah, let me get out of here. So you're referring to when I was saying I want like the red and the green to be the same brightness?
Yeah, you did it just visually and said, I don't know if that's the best way to do it, or.
To be honest, I wouldn't worry about it that much.
Okay.
They're probably like one thing you could do is always just add a curves layer and you would be able to see the spike.
Oh, okay, it's on the spike. Huh?
And then you could say, okay, let me see. Are those spikes the same spot? Pretty much, yeah.
Mm.
That's one way to do it. But you know, it's such a minor thing to begin with. Let me just show you what would actually happen, because that might make this more obvious. I'm going to make this a little bit brighter now than the reds, right? And if we revert everything back, okay. Now what I'm going to do, we're kind of starting over again. I'll grab the green data, paste it in on green, grab the red data, paste it in on red. See how there's kind of a nasty green color cast now in the shadows, greenish blue.
Yeah.
That's because the green layer here is just a tad brighter than the reds and the blues. See that?
Yeah.
And so that's what I was getting at, is that if you mess it up a little bit, it's not the end of the world. I would just come in here, add a curves adjustment layer, and then use that black point dropper and say, you know, this needs to be black, not green, and click. And it definitely went too far. So I'll just click somewhere else. And that's fairly neutral right there.
And you don't do anything to the pictures taken with the different filters except for just aligning them, huh?
You're referring like this guy here?
Yeah, I'm saying between the three. So for example, red is all stacked together, green is all stacked together. But then you have to align the red and the greens. And so you do that alignment elsewhere and bring them in here.
Right. I do all my stacking in Deep Sky Stacker.
Okay, DSS. Okay.
Yeah. And I don't have my external hard drive connected, but I've got some videos on YouTube for the Deep Sky Stacker as well. If you have any questions, okay. It's a little confusing at first, but it's not too hard to use.
All right. Got it, Peter. Thank you so much. Any questions from anybody else? I don't think we have any questions, Peter. I really appreciate for you taking the time and going through this. I found it very useful. I'm sure a lot of the folks on the Zoom call also found it very useful. So Peter, thank you again, and we will post the video of your presentation on our YouTube channel. Thank you very much.
All right. Yeah. Thank you guys. I hope you enjoyed it, and hopefully it wasn't too boring, but
Yeah, wait,
yeah.
there's probably a couple of questions here. Oh yeah, thanks from a couple of people here. This was great. Yeah, I think they're just echoing my sentiments here, having enjoyed it. Thank you so much, Peter.
All right. Thanks again, guys.
Yeah, take care. Huh?
All right. I'll see you.
Yeah, bye-bye.